something to make the community a little more self-sustaining and resilient. I moved here about 4 years ago. Joey, where are you? Are you back there? Please stand up. Here's Joey Lowe's and Patty Ryan. Patty Ryan, my two partners in crime. Thank you, ladies. Joey was running kind of ran around in a food circle here. As of what year did you start?
A while ago.
I would say 2012, 10.
2010?
About 6 years.
Yeah. So when I arrived on the scene about 2013, they were charging away, and it was great. I mean, coming to a community where people really sat down and ate, and you knew your neighbor. Herman's like 2,500 people. I always tell people the good news is everybody knows everybody. The bad news is everybody knows everybody. But anyway, love this community, and really I'm happy to be a part of bringing it together in some ways. I've been following Guy probably about 10 years now, just tracking how it is to live on a finite world with finite resources and a seemingly infinite population. And that's what kind of hooked me on that. I'm very nature-based. I can tell things are changing. I'm a native Missourian, so I can tell things are changing. Species are here that weren't here even 20 years ago. So I feel the climate is changing. Herman just had almost a 36-foot river reading on a 21-foot flood reading. So we had a lot of interesting water that made getting about town very challenging. But anyway, I know you didn't come to listen to me ratchet jaw. So one thing I do want to say is a little bit of admin stuff. The bathroom, for those of you who aren't familiar with this building, there's a hook around there to the right, and come in and you can't miss it. Guy is wonderful enough to do this at no cost. There is a donation jar somewhere. Patty has it. We really appreciate your donation, and we don't take any of it. All of it, 100% of it goes to Guy, so we would appreciate. He's coming. He and Pauline, his partner in crime, have come from Belize, so we really appreciate it. We give him and her some financial incentive to come back. But anyway, without further ado, Guy.
Thank you, Stephanie. Thanks to Harris. Thanks to all of you, of course, for coming. It would be pretty lonely up here if you were not there. Thanks to my partner, Pauline, who's behind the camera over there, who's been traveling with me. You can only imagine what that's like. I can't even imagine traveling with me. I'm such a bummer.
I don't have to imagine.
So there's that. Anyway, you've been given a terminal diagnosis. You were given the terminal diagnosis at birth. We all know that birth is a sexually transmitted disease that is proven fatal in every case. And yet we act otherwise. We act as if we're going to live forever. And we act almost like everybody else around us. We go to school some more, we get married, we have 2.5 children, we raise our children, wait 40 years, and we retire, and then we think about how we're going to enjoy it the rest of our lives. It's absurd. Almost all of us act the same way, myself included, for a long time. Now that you've been given a terminal diagnosis and you've come to recognize it, the question emerges, how do we act? What if you only have 10 years? What if you only have 5? What if you only have 10 months? What if you only have 4 months? What if you only have 4 weeks? Does your response change? How shall I live my life? What do you do in light of a terminal diagnosis? After all, as Homer pointed out some 2,600 years ago, any moment might be our last. Any moment might be our last. How do we live with that information? I suspect most people, in light of a terminal diagnosis, do not mope around. Okay, maybe for the first little bit upon learning of their terminal diagnosis. Like when I was 11, I was devastated. My grandmother died. She was the first person relatively close to me who died. And I cried for weeks. And then much later, probably 10 years later, it took me to figure out that I wasn't really crying for her. I barely knew her. We would visit her once a year. It was a long way away. I barely knew this woman, but I cried at the age of 11 because her death reminded me that I have to die too. And so I was coming to grips with my own mortality. So when I got the terminal diagnosis, I cried for a little while. But then most of us move beyond that, we begin to live. And for most people who have been given a terminal diagnosis, who have been told that they have 6 weeks or 8 weeks or 8 months or 8 years to live, it becomes about living. They begin to think about the things that they've always wanted to do. And they try to get them done. Hopefully, people have an opportunity to complete the relationships in their lives. The opportunity to say goodbye. The opportunity to tell somebody that you love them. That's the gift of a terminal diagnosis, is that it gives us an opportunity to complete those relationships, which I suspect everybody in this room deems more important than accomplishments and material possessions. The relationships are what make our lives worth living. Living with a terminal diagnosis obviously varies for every person. Some people have a bucket list. Some people have I used to have a bucket list. It was like this long. And over the course of the last 15 or 20 years, since I first comprised my bucket list has grown not necessarily because I've completed everything off the list and checked it off, but rather because my bucket list has become longer than my bucket list. There's a whole bunch of things I just don't care about anymore. I don't really need to float down the Grand Canyon. I just don't. That was on my bucket list for a long time. I don't need to jump out of a perfectly good airplane. I've done that a few times. That's why I got to cross that one off. But there's a bunch of things that I realize I don't need to do. They fall under the category of accomplishment rather than relationship. So they're not particularly fulfilling for me anymore. I love that some people in light of the terminal diagnosis begin drinking wine as soon as they showed up. Like a whole table full of it. I guess you saw me coming.
Coping mechanism.
And by the way, in light of our terminal diagnosis, regardless of how long we have left, and I suspect it's not very long, I have never proposed inaction. Rather, I have proposed what a Buddhist might call right action. I'm not Buddhist. I've been strongly influenced by Buddhist philosophy, if not Buddhist religion. Buddhists believe in something called right action, right thought, and a bunch of other right things. And taking right action, especially in light of a terminal diagnosis, is a pretty good measure of our character. In addition, another tenet of Buddhist philosophy is to not be attached to the outcome. So I have attempted to take right actions throughout my life, and almost every time I realize afterwards that it didn't turn out quite the way I planned. If I were attached to the outcome of my actions, I would be devastated by now. I've realized that I'm over about 1 million. And yet, what better judge of our character than how we act in the face of impossible odds? When there's no way we can make a difference in the world, and we take the right actions anyway. We act with compassion. We act with love. We pursue excellence, even though it doesn't make a bit of difference to the world around us. Some people, in fact, find my message liberating. This series of lines comes from Serena Raphael, 25 years old, in Western Australia. And Serena came home from university one day to find her housemate awash in emotions and blood, because she knew that her university professors had been lying to her. She knew that her baby boom generation university professors were not telling her the truth. And what they were telling her, and what almost every professor I know about today tells the millennials is, you need to fix it. Climate change is a major problem. You need to fix it. We're in the midst of the sixth mass extinction. You need to fix it. We have fouled the air and dirtied the water and washed the soil into the ocean. We have gone far into human population overshoot. You need to fix it. How insane. It's not their mess. And so she points out older generations must stop dumping it on us. It wasn't our generation, it wasn't the millennials who created this series of disasters. We can't expect them to fix it. Small wonder Serena's friend was on the verge of suicide because she's been told her entire life, you need to fix it. And she knows it's unfixable. This is a predicament. It's not a problem. Solutions have problems. Math books have problems. You look in the back and there's a solution. Predicaments don't have solutions. We just live with them. We've all been given a predicament. We've been given a terminal diagnosis. I want to talk a little bit about my favorite subject. That would be me. Please bear with me. I had no idea. I was 36 years old and I had ongoing surveillance. And I found out much later, in fact, June 24th of last year, about a year ago, I found out for the first time that I had been surveilled for the last 20-some years. That's how good they are, for one thing. And it was right out in the open. It was so obvious. It was that invisible receptionist who handled every piece of mail and every piece of correspondence and was a single mother and was always in dire financial straits. Who else could it have been? She was the contact on the inside. Of course she was. And then I had an NSA contracted spy in my classroom in 2005. No clue. If he were to walk in here today, I would not be able to pick him out of the lineup. He told me these things, he being Mark Austin, his cover. He told me these things a few days after he left service as an NSA contracted spy. So he thought he was escaping. He moved to Costa Rica and tried to save some sea turtles. Well then, apparently around the election last fall, things got a little dicey for the federal government, so he was called back into service. Apparently, when you're an NSA contracted spy, you don't really have a choice about how long you get to retire. In any event. And of course, I can't be too sure about any of this, because he admits he's a spy. And what's the job of spies? To lie. So I don't know how much of this is true and how much of this is not true. I suspect, based on the heavily redacted reports I've seen, that he's the real deal, and that he's at least providing some information, because he tells me things about me that nobody knows except me. Which makes me a little sketchy already. He points out that the Jason Group at the Pentagon, and these are the smartest people in the room, the Jason Group, in a report to be published later this year, finds that rather than going Venus, Earth will instead go Mars. Because of abrupt climate change leading to the catastrophic meltdown of the world's 440-some nuclear power facilities, that ionizing radiation is going to go up into the atmosphere, strip away the atmosphere. So unlike Venus, which has a very heavy atmosphere and keeps the temperature at about 462 degrees Celsius, we're going to more closely resemble Mars. And the date he listed was 2054. That's not long. Most climate scientists do malpractice. Most climate scientists won't tell you what I know, even though they know what I know, because they have something to protect. I have nothing to protect. I have no job. I haven't received a paycheck since walking away from an irredeemably corrupt system in 2009. So I'm not doing this for money. I'm not fleecing you, contrary to the rumors you read on the internet. I'm not manipulating you in any way. I'm trying to provide the information that I have at my disposal. And the information is constantly updated because every day we read about a new report from the referee journal literature, the incredibly conservative referee journal literature, indicating the situation is far worse than it was yesterday, much less a year ago or 10 years ago. More about me. Did I mention that part? Yeah. January 2007, my department had just hired a new department head, and I was filled with glee because this was a friend of mine. I was involved in the hiring process. During the interview, she looked me right in the eye and told me I will fall on my sword to protect your academic freedom, because at this point the university had already been trying to heavily censor me. And so this is a friend of mine, somebody I knew from a long way back, and one of the things we shared in common is that we love to teach. We're at a Research One institution where almost all of the perks come because of good research. Your scholarship is really what matters, because that's what brings in the money. We were both teachers, and so I was excited as I could be to have Lisa as my department head. And so when I came in to her office 2 or 3 days after she started her job as the new department head, we hugged on the way in the door. After all, we're longtime friends. And then we sit down and she tells me, one of the few pieces of power I have as a department head is I get to decide which classes the faculty teach. And I have decided that you are no longer going to teach any classes in this department. Let me be clear about something. The reason I'm here in front of you today is because I'm a teacher. It's not what I do, it's who I am. When I was 6 years old, I dragged the Dick and Jane primer home to my 4.5-year-old sister, poor Carol, and I tried to teach her how to read. And I was so frustrated 2 weeks into my first grade experience that my 4.5-year-old sister didn't know the difference between Spot and a dog and between Puff and a cat that I was outraged. Elvis Costello in the song about the red shoes provides a good piece of advice on this one. I used to be disgusted, now I try to be amused. Mostly at myself. I continued for another 2 years or so at the University of Arizona, but I couldn't do what I love to do, which was to connect intimately with students over the course of an entire semester, or in many cases over the course of an entire lifetime after that. Instead, I was teaching in a program called Poetry Inside Out. Inside was the men's pods of the Pima County Jail and the girls' pods of the Pima County Juvenile Detention Facility. Out was a Hispanic-dominated inner-city high school where most of the students had been kicked out of at least 3 other more conventional high schools, and that was their entrance card into their new school. And then the fourth leg of the program was my honors course, because once I could no longer teach in my home department, the Honors College was happy to have me because I was pushing the cultural envelopes. And so I was teaching this program through the Honors College. I would take my honors students, all of them, essentially all of them, upper middle class Caucasian kids, into juvie hall. In a juvie hall, there were 13 to 17-year-old Latina girls and women, and they were not upper middle class. They were poor. They were parented by a single parent or a sister. They were taking care of their younger kids, their younger siblings. Some of them were parents. A third of them in the high school approximately were parents. Many of them were homeless. They'd been shot at, they'd been stabbed. They'd had a friend die in their arms. They'd been abused in every imaginable way, and most recently sexually abused by their mother's current boyfriend. I'd asked them honor students when we came out of juvie hall after an hour and a half or 2 hours, I'd asked the upper middle class white kids, what was that like for you? And they would think for a minute there on the bench in the shade, and they would say, almost universally, they would say something like, they're just like me. They came to recognize that our similarities overwhelm our differences. So these wealthy white kids were seeing that these poor Hispanic kids, almost the same age, were just like them. They'd had different life experiences, mostly as a result of their color and the amount of money they had access to. And the students came to recognize this. And in fact, the girls in Judy Hall, almost every week, one of them would come up to me and whisper, "I think I'm as smart as these honor students of yours." I couldn't argue with them there. "I think I should go to college. Do you think I could go to college?" "Yeah, I think you can go to college." These kids were learning empathy. I think it's the most important thing we can learn. I have no idea how to teach it. I think I was asked to not teach, not because I was a poor teacher. In fact, I want to distinguish here between teaching and learning. I think I was a really good teacher. I taught my dog to whistle. I taught and I taught and I taught. My dog never did learn to whistle, but I was a really good teacher, I kept telling myself. That's the conservative approach. Ultimately, I realized that it's about the learning, it's not about the teaching, and the most important thing we can learn is empathy. By the time I had that meeting with my new department head, in my second year on campus at the University of Arizona, I was awarded the highest advising recognition given by my home college, the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences. And 5 years before that meeting, I was acknowledged by the graduate college as one of 2 faculty per year to be recognized with their highest award. So this is one of the 2 transdisciplinary colleges at the University of Arizona. The other recognized me with their highest honor, Faculty of the year I left active service at the University of Arizona. So I think actually I was really quite good at teaching. I think my students were learning empathy. I used anarchism in my classrooms. It's not a bad thing. Chaos is the absence of rules. Anarchy is the absence of rulers, just to be clear. Anarchism means taking responsibility for yourself and for your neighbors, human and otherwise. So I was modeling anarchism in my classrooms, and as it turns out, the deep state didn't really appreciate that. Oh no. I didn't really think about it. It seemed like a good idea at the time. Thus, I was surveilled since 1996 and had that spy in my classrooms, I think because I was a radical. And this square root symbol, this is actually called a radical. It has a name. When I ask college students what it is, they tell me it's a square root symbol. That's its function. And what is it called? A radical. Why? Because it gets to the root. If you look up definition of radical, it doesn't mean extremist or terrorist or the guy that blew up the plane, tried to blow up the plane with his shoes. It doesn't say any of those things. Radicalism means getting to the root. And I've been getting to the root for a long time. That's why I attracted the attention of the government. You know, there are 3 Chinese curses. Most people know the one, the third most dire of the Chinese curses. May you live in interesting times. Most people know about that one. What's the second most dire of them? May you attract the attention of the government. Shazam! And number 3, and the worst of them all, may you find what you're looking for. Be careful. As an indication of my early days as a radical, this is a snippet from my high school valedictory address, delivered with as much hubris as any 18-year-old could possibly manage. Anyone can be a conformist, so I gave my classmates permission to be a nonconformist, if that's what it takes. I only discovered this last November. I was going through my scrapbooks from when I was 18. What's I doing that for? It's kind of a strange thing anyway. And I discovered this line. I had no memory of this, of course, and it was in the newspaper article, so it must be true. So I think I was radicalized from a fairly early age. In fact, it was in my early days of classroom teaching that I was pointing out the lies my culture told me, including the myth of human superiority. The title of Derek Jensen's latest book is The Myth of Human Supremacy, as if we're superior in some way. In fact, we don't ever say this out loud because people would laugh. Or if somebody comes up and says humans are actually superior to all other animals, then you would just answer, okay, well, why don't you go live the rest of your life on the nuts from oak trees? Now you don't seem so swift, do you? But what do we call, so we don't say it out loud, we don't say humans are superior, in fact we just assume it. We just assume that away. Of course we are. How do we assume it? With our language. What do we call non-human animals? We call them lesser animals or lower animals. That doesn't sound so sweet, does it? We can have infinite growth on a finite planet. Of course, nobody would say that out loud because you'd laugh in their face. We just assume it away. That's why we have a positive discount rate or a positive interest rate. That's why you continue to draw, albeit a minor amount, of income from the money you put in the bank. Because we assume infinite growth. It doesn't make any sense to assume infinite growth on a finite planet. But that's what we do. And so far it's worked great. We've enjoyed a period of economic expansion since at least World War II. That's unparalleled in human history. More is better, of course it is. Everybody says future generations will have access to more, and they mean more of everything. And they mean more is better, no matter what the more is. We monetize everything. When I was on tour in New Zealand in November and December of last year, New Zealand Air was going for 85 cents a breath in Beijing. I couldn't make this up. They were canning the air in 10 cans. Imagine how much that cost. Filling them with New Zealand Air, transporting them to Beijing, and people were buying them for 85 cents a breath.
You just open the can.
Open the can, breathe.
This is kind of a gimmick, right?
No.
Like a pet rock.
Have you been to Beijing? The air is unbreathable.
Yeah.
Oh.
Hazmat.
So there's all kinds of tricks that people are playing on themselves to make them breathe the air and pretend that the air is fine. But that's what civilization does. We foul the air, we dirty the water, we destroy the food, we poison the food, and then we monetize it and people pay for it. Sounds like quite a sweet gig, doesn't it? None of this happened before civilizations arose a few thousand years ago. The first 2.8 million years of the genus Homo, since Homo erectus on this planet, 2.8 million years, there was no monetizing the food. That only came about when we began to store grains, when we began to grow grains at scale and store grains. When did that happen? Well, interestingly enough, it happened when we came out of the last ice age. The global average temperature increased about 1.5 degrees Celsius. That's it, about 3 degrees Fahrenheit. And then it stabilized. It was stable for nearly 11,000 years. And within a couple of thousand years, the first civilizations ever arose. A handful of places around the globe, suddenly people were growing grains at scale. And once you can grow grains, you can store the food and get through the hard times. It's no longer a hunter-gatherer or day-to-day experience. Now we can store the food. And once you can store the food, you can control the people. And you can make a lot more people too. And so multiple civilizations have come and gone because they went into human population overshoot, albeit at the local or regional level. Now we're there at the global level, way down that road. So what happens next will be most interesting. We're told to think positive. We actually say this one out loud. If you don't have hope, there's something wrong with you. You might be clinically depressed. People ask me all the time if I'm depressed. No, but I am a carrier. Pain is mandatory. Suffering is optional. That's in your head. That's how you respond to what comes at you. I think hope is a horrible idea. I'm hope-free. I gave up on it years ago. I have no hope, and I don't have any of the other side of the I don't know the future coin either. That other four-letter word, fear. Fear is projecting something into the future that you don't have any control over. Hope is projecting into the future something that you don't have any control over. They're the same thing. We hope something will work out. We fear it won't. But we don't assume control over any of that. It just happens to us. I'm hope-free. I no longer wish for a future over which I have no agency. That's the definition of hope. Hope is wishful thinking. I live now. I live fully now, as fully as I can now. Because I think hoping for everything to turn out fine when we've crapped in our nest for several thousand years is probably not the wisest approach. I think that fearing a future that might indeed be dystopian is not a good approach either. Hope and fear. I don't have much room for either of them. This society, this culture, this civilization is characterized by endemic racism, just like every civilization before ours. It's also characterized by endemic misogyny, endemic monetary disparity leading to poverty. And then the United States elects a misogynist, racist, wealthy man, and people are surprised. I'm sorry, did I say that out loud? I've been doing stand-up tragedy for so long. I don't think that's going to slow me down anymore. Daniel Dennett was talking about religion when he said there's simply no polite way to tell people they've dedicated their lives to an illusion. So he's a well-known atheist, Daniel Dennett, and so he says things like this, and he's talking about religion, and so am I. There's no polite way to tell people they've dedicated their lives to an illusion. It's all an illusion. Climate change is just one outcome of a set of living arrangements characterized by lies. I call it civilization for a reason. It's all founded on a pack of lies. The science part of the show can be summarized in 3 slides, but I'll subject you to a little bit more torture than that. We could just point out that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, perhaps the most conservative scientific body in the history of the planet, concluded in their 2014 vaunted 5th assessment, heavily leaked beginning in September 2013, that global warming is irreversible without massive geoengineering of the atmosphere's chemistry. In other words, we've gone over the cliff. This is the IPCC. It's irreversible. What that means, just to be clear, is that it can't be reversed. In the absence of massive geoengineering of the atmosphere's chemistry, what does that mean? To quote Truthout, that means fantasy technology. There's no such way for that to work. The sciences, ever late to the party, even behind the journalists, in 2 major synthetic documents, one produced by the United States National Academy of Sciences, the other produced by a European body of similar stature, concluded that geoengineering is not a solution. So there you have it. Global warming is irreversible without massive geoengineering of the atmosphere's chemistry, and geoengineering won't work. If you're thinking to yourself, this might turn out bad, I think you got it figured out. In fact, we now know that civilization is an omnicidal heat engine. It's civilization that's responsible for fouling that air and dirtying that water and washing the soil into the ocean. It's civilization that has monetized everything. It's civilization that's characterized by endemic racism and endemic misogyny. It's civilization that has convinced us of all these lies to such a great extent that they become assumptions, undergirding how we live. We don't even talk about them. We just assume that everybody's going to go to school, and then they're going to go to school a little bit more, and then they're going to get married, and they're going to have 2.5 children, and they're going to work like slaves for 40 years, and then finally they're going to step back and go, what should I do with my life? My parents did that. My dad started teaching the day he turned 20, and he counted every day from then on until retirement. And he retired, and then he didn't know what to do because he was just counting the days to retirement. So of course, within a year, he was back at the same job doing the same thing. This time superintendent of a different school district than the one he left. And then he thought for the next couple of years about what it means to be him and what he actually enjoys in his life, what he might like to do for the rest of it. But he was on the treadmill to such a great extent, just like almost all of us are, that he didn't even really think about it. The faster he went, the more the bars became a blur. And then he stepped off the treadmill and he recognized that there were bars there and they had been there for the last 35 years. And now he's out. What does it mean? Civilization is an omnicidal heat engine. According to the United Nations report from August 2010, we drive to extinction an estimated 150 to 200 species. 150 to 200 species driven to extinction every day. That's what civilization does. When I recognize civilization as an omnicidal heat engine, killing everything in its path, every aspect of the living planet, I did something that was deemed absolutely crazy. And who am I to argue? I left active service at the university. I was 49 years old. I was a full professor. I'm one of a handful of people in the last 2 decades that has been granted full professor status at any university before the age of 40 years old. I suspect I'm the only person at the University of Arizona to be awarded the top honors by the 2 transdisciplinary colleges in the entire university. So, when I walked away from imperialism, when I left active service at the university and pulled my money out and decided we're going to live differently, I'm going to grow food for people, and I'm not going to participate in the omnicide of the civilization, I just knew that everybody would follow. It was the same sort of hubris I had when I was 18, and I was telling people that they could live differently if they so choose. I expected, because I'm a privileged person at a university, I'm a thing, right? I'm 49 years old, and you're going to follow me just like my students did, out on the field trips. I used to be disgusted, and now I try to be amused. Within 2 years, I was able to grow an enormous amount of food. You have to bear in mind that when I started this project, I could barely distinguish between a screwdriver and a zucchini. Didn't know anything. I was a lifelong academic. I tried to fix my toilet in my house that I sold in suburban Tucson, Arizona. I tried to fix my toilet. It ended up costing me $500 in a new toilet. It's like a 25-cent repair. And next thing you know, I'm building structures. I didn't build a straw bale house, but I built this outdoor kitchen. I built a partially subterranean straw bale greenhouse. And I built all these things, and I built a goat shed to keep the goats. And I learned how to take care of goats and chickens and ducks, turkeys, and a goose named Myrtle. The memories. And I learned how to grow food and make biochar. I designed a biochar kiln so that I could take the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and put it into the soil for the next few thousand years, because I'm fixing climate change, among other things. And then, within a couple of years, I realized that not a lot of people were going to follow. And then a couple of years after that, I realized that we had triggered an event called abrupt climate change. It was completely different than this linear Al Gore style climate change that most of us are familiar with. And that's what I was familiar with. It was 2007 when I made the decision to move here. We didn't know anything. Let me put that another way. I didn't know anything. 2007? Come on. Well, now we're in the midst of a phenomenon called abrupt climate change, which has historical precedence. It has occurred in planetary history, albeit not when humans were involved. And now we're spewing carbon and driving the rate of extinction at least 10 times faster than ever before in planetary history. So let's look back over the course of the last 2 billion years. This is the timeline. This is the temperature. And you see that for the most part there's 2 stable temperatures. There's ice age, 12 degrees Celsius, 54 degrees Fahrenheit. And then relatively abruptly, the planet comes out of an ice age and goes up to a hothouse condition, 72 degrees Fahrenheit, 22 degrees Celsius. It's only 10 degrees. It's only 18 degrees Fahrenheit. Well, most of us have experienced more than 18 degrees difference Fahrenheit today. You go outside, you come inside. Outside it was below 54 this morning. It's probably warmer than 72 in here right now. So you're thinking, what could possibly go wrong? The issue is not how our bodies respond, our bodies per se, to the temperature. Rather, the issue is one of habitat. I'm a conservation biologist. Conservation biologists are involved with studying three basic tenets. Three basic underpinnings of conservation biology are speciation, how and where and when does a species come into being. Homo sapiens arose about 200,000 years ago, as a minor example. Homo sapiens, our favorite species, the wise ape. 2, extinction, when and why does a species go away? And we now know, as we've known for a long time, that most species go extinct because they run out of habitat. Almost no species goes extinct because we hunted them all. We almost certainly killed the last dodo. We certainly killed the last passenger pigeon. It died in the Cincinnati Zoo in the early 1900s. We certainly killed the last Carolina parakeet. It died in the Cincinnati Zoo in the early 1900s. If you ever find yourself in the Cincinnati Zoo and you seem lonely, I want to get the hell out of there. Apparently it's a place where all the birds go to die. So we actually did hunt to extinction some organisms, but almost all species on the planet that have ever gone extinct, which is 99% of the species on the planet so far, they go extinct. Almost all of them did so because they ran out of habitat. Many of them ran out of habitat because the global average temperature of the planet increased from 12 degrees Celsius to 22 or 23 degrees Celsius in a short period of time. That's what happened in each of the 5 previous mass extinction events, and is happening in this, the 6th mass extinction event in planetary history. During the Great Dying 252.2 million years ago, that's this one right here, the global average temperature of the planet came out of an ice age at 12 degrees Celsius, and in somewhere between 1 and 3 pulses went up to 23 degrees Celsius. And that transition took somewhere between 880 and 18,800 years. So roughly 900 to roughly 19,000 years. We're going from here to a similar temperature. Actually, we're going from right there where civilization is, 1.5 degrees above ice age, 13.5 degrees Celsius, to here, plus or minus 1/10 of a degree, over the course of the next 9 years or so. Almost all complex life on Earth died during the Great Dying. More than 90% of the species on the planet went extinct during this relatively abrupt rise in global average temperature because those species lost habitat. Because the plants could not keep up with the rate of change. It's a delicate web. You're a native grass out there growing in a prairie 5 miles from this town. You're growing in that spot because your seed landed there and because your particular species, you as an example of your species, have developed over evolutionary time for a very narrow range of environmental conditions. Very narrow. So that the rain comes at a certain time and the temperature increases and decreases at a certain time. And in this part of the world, because fire is swept through periodically. And also because there's a whole bunch of things going on below ground and above ground that we humans aren't even really paying attention to. If you're a grass that has been succeeding in these parts, or say in the Flint Hills of Kansas, has been succeeding in this part of the world for thousands of years, it's because you have a relationship with a bunch of other organisms. You have relationships with pollinators. You have relationships with mycorrhizae that are below ground, with fungi that are below ground. You only get to drink water, to take water into your roots because you've established a relationship with the mycorrhizae. So people frequently tell me, when it gets hot, we'll just all move north.
Huh?
Okay, Are we going to take all of the mycorrhizae and all of the fungi and all the soils and all of the plants with us? Because if we don't, it's not going to do any good. And those plants can't get there as fast as the temperature is changing. If there's a mantra for realtors who happen to be conservation biologists, and I can't believe there hasn't been more intersection between those fields, then the mantra is habitat, habitat, habitat. We require an unbelievably narrow range of environmental conditions. And if we don't have those conditions, we alter the environment accordingly. We build structures, we put on clothes, we make fire. That was probably the first mistake. We create language, mistake number 2. This is how we mediate for an environment that we don't quite fit into. But you have to remember that we depend upon thousands, hundreds of thousands of other species too. And if you don't think you depend upon hundreds of other species, consider this: your body is comprised of hundreds of other species. And if just one of those species is having a bad day and it's in your stomach, you're not having a good day either. We've all had that experience. So if we don't take care of the delicate web that is taking care of us, we're screwed. As it turns out, we haven't been taking care of the delicate web that is taking care of us. There are hundreds of species on and in your body that regulate how you respond to the environment and the food you eat and the water you drink. You notice this every time, say for example, you travel to a foreign place. It doesn't even have to be out of the United States. It's a place where the water is treated just a little bit differently and the water is sourced just a little bit differently, and you have this sort of stomach thing going on for 2 or 3 days after that. It's a delicate web. The organisms in your body are accustomed to here. They're not accustomed to Alaska, they're not accustomed to Hawaii, and they certainly aren't accustomed to Belize. So, humans arose, our favorite species, some 200,000 years ago. Civilization arose a few thousand years ago in light of this rise in temperature of 1.5 degrees Celsius, and then a stability in that temperature. So the temperature has been stable for 11,000 years, more or less, since we entered the Holocene, since we came out of the last ice age. It's that stable, cool temperature that allows us to grow grains at scale. Thus did arise several civilizations around the planet at about the same time. According to James Hansen, the godfather of climate change, in a legal brief filed about 2 years ago, humans have persisted on this planet only up to about 2 degrees Celsius above the 1750 baseline. We're currently, that takes us to right here. Sorry, we are currently right here where the blue arrow is, and we've had humans up to right here. And I suspect we've had humans up to right here because that's where we find habitat for humans. We're human animals. We sometimes forget about that latter part. We are very clever. I think instead of calling ourselves Homo sapiens, the wise apes, we probably should have called ourselves Homo calidus, the clever ape. We are very clever. We have managed to overwhelm nature and bend nature to suit our demands. And yet, we've only had Homo sapiens on the planet right to there. And we're already at least right there. We've also had humans on the planet only for this thin slice in time. The universe is about 14 billion years old. 13.8, 14 billion years old. The planet is about 4.6 billion years old. And humans, Homo sapiens, have been here for 200,000 years. If the universe is all about us, damn, was that universe patient? Huh? I mean, the universe waited a long time. The universe has waited 13.8 billion years. When are those humans going to show up? Things are going to get exciting when the humans show up. When is that going to, is that late already? That's amazing. We think it's all about us. Do we not? I mean, not just as individuals. Never mind the filled with hubris examples I've given about myself so far. I'm sure you're all a finer person than I am, so you don't have those issues. But consider, for example, the reign of the universe, 13.8 billion years of the universe. When did humans show up? That would be the last few cells on the end of my Oh, I'm sorry. I mean, that's it. I just scraped us off. It's like the universe might do. Seemingly uncaring about the universe's favorite invention, humans. So we haven't been here for very long. By title in the Guardian, Oliver Tickell points out in August 2008 on Planet 4C Hydrogen, he's talking about 4C above baseline. All we can prepare for is extinction. In this assessment, Tickell concludes that we are human animals and that we are going to persist up to about right there where the green arrow is. Actually, he then goes on, and I think in a terrible fit of hubris, concludes that we'll survive even beyond that point, maybe even 6 degrees Celsius.
Huh.
But, really? Anyway, I'm not going to bicker about that. I think it's optimistic to think that we're going to make it to there. I think it's very optimistic to think that humans are going to be on the planet at 5 or 6 degrees Celsius above the 1750 baseline. But we don't really know, do we? We haven't quite gone extinct yet. I don't know if you've noticed, but we added another 200 and some thousand people to the planet today. That's births minus deaths. So apparently we're not going away today. When do we go extinct? I don't know. When are you going to die? I get this question all the time. Okay, first question from the audience. Yes, sir. First question, when am I going to die? I mean, nobody states it that way because it sounds a little silly, but that's really what they mean. They say something like, okay, I live in New York. And then like I'm supposed to read their mind, because I am. When are things going to get bad in New York? Or sometimes somebody will come right out and say, when does the shit hit the fan? And I say, are you kidding? The fan is covered with shit. The shit has been hitting the fan for so long that the fan is covered with shit, and the shit is hitting the shit. And you just didn't notice. But if you lived in the Middle East or Northern Africa, if you lived in the South Pacific on one of those islands where there's no longer habitat for humans, you noticed. If you live in the Middle East or Northern Africa, I was touring Europe 2 years ago, and Europeans, we tend to think of them as being very accommodating, open-minded, liberal, love fest kind of people, because after all, that's our roots, so they must be, a lot like us. I was touring West